The glass auditorium glittered with light, but inside, I felt the air grow heavy as if every breath was borrowed. My slides still glowed faintly across the towering screen when Martin Kellerman, the CEO, rose from his chair. He adjusted his tie with exaggerated precision, then leaned into the microphone. His voice carried through the sound system with sharp clarity, slicing the air before I could continue my presentation. "Kelly Bryant's ideas are outdated," he declared, pausing long enough for the words to land. "We need vision for the future, not relics from the past. Effective immediately, she's fired." A murmur spread like ripples across the glass walls. I could feel the room fracture into factions. Some gasped in disbelief, their eyes softening with pity, while others exchanged knowing smirks, already aligning themselves with Martin's cruelty. A few even applauded lightly, as if my dismissal were part of the show. If you carry the same burden, do a little thing for yourself right now. Gently massage your palms for 30 seconds. It's a gentle way to relieve stress. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Let me know where you're watching. I'd like to invite you to hit that like button and subscribe to keep hearing meaningful stories. Then, as if scripted for maximum humiliation, a rising star within the company, a young analyst named Jenna Cross, who had just been promoted last week, stood and strode to the stage. Without hesitation, she slid into the chair beside Martin, the chair that had been mine for years. She tapped her pen against the table with a self-satisfied rhythm, staking her claim before my body had even left the stage. The shame was sharp. But what struck me harder was the realization of how quickly loyalty dissolves under fluorescent lights. 17 years of sacrifice, missed birthdays, sleepless nights, deadlines met at the expense of my own family, had been erased with a single sentence. Yet, while the crowd shifted uncomfortably, waiting for me to defend myself, I did nothing of the sort. Instead, I reached down and closed my laptop. Its lid was covered in my daughter's stickers, reminders of a life I had kept on hold. The sound of the click was small, almost trivial, but it echoed through the auditorium like a gavel. I lifted the computer, steadied my breath, and walked toward the exit. No protest, no tears, just silence. And that silence unsettled them more than any outburst could have. Eyes followed me, uneasy, as if they sensed something they could not name. The mirrored elevator doors slid shut with a metallic sigh, sealing me inside a capsule of silence. My reflection stared back from every surface. 3, 4, 5 versions of me, all wearing the same stunned expression. My pulse thundered in my ears, not from panic, but from the effort of holding my fury beneath the skin. Rage wanted to claw its way out, to scream and curse and break something, but I pressed it down, layer upon layer, until it felt like glass splintering inside my chest. The numbers above the door blinked slowly. 32, 31, 30. Each floor carried me further from the stage where Martin Kellerman had gutted my career with one sentence. Each floor reminded me of the years I had given him without hesitation. As the elevator descended, my mind betrayed me with memories. My father's funeral snow on the ground, my mother's shaking hands clutching the casket handle. I hadn't been there. I had been in this same building, hunched over a server rack, racing to fix a bug before a client demo. Martin had sent me a one-line email, "Take care of it tomorrow." Tomorrow never came. Then my daughter's violin recital, her first solo, the one she had begged me to attend. She had practiced in the living room for weeks, tiny fingers aching from the strings. On the night of her performance, I was here again, trapped in another urgent meeting. I watched the grainy video later, the empty seat in the front row like a spotlight on my absence. Her eyes had searched for me as she played, and I wasn't there. Those sacrifices had been stacked, one on top of another, until they formed the very foundation of Orion's empire. Martin called them old ideas. To me, they were years of my life carved out of flesh and bone. A shuffle broke the silence. I wasn't alone. In the corner, leaning against the mirrored wall, a young employee with slick hair and the smugness of someone freshly promoted glanced at me. He didn't meet my eyes, just muttered under his breath, "Fresh blood will save this company." The words hit harder than Martin's announcement. Fresh blood like mine had been nothing. Like the decades I'd given were ashes scattered in the air. My throat burned, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of a reply. Instead, I let the anger coil tighter inside me, a serpent waiting to strike. Then, without warning, the corners of my mouth curved upward. A soundless laugh, half bitterness, half promise escaped me, because I knew something that boy, that CEO, that entire company had forgotten the patents weren't Orion's. They were mine. Quietly, 2 years earlier, I had moved them under my own LLC, buried in filings no one cared to read. The elevator dinged, the doors opened. My rage remained caged, silent but sharp, and my smile small. Dangerous was the only hint of the storm still to come. The revolving doors released me into the sharp brightness of morning, and the city swallowed me whole. Cars rushed past, horns barked, people hurried with their coffees and briefcases, unaware that my world had just been reduced to a headline of humiliation. I stood for a moment on the granite steps, letting the sunlight strike my face. I refused to let the building behind me, with its mirrored glass and hollow applause, be the last image burned into my mind. Then my phone vibrated. I glanced down. The screen glowed with a message only I had expected to see: network instability detected. Safeguard countdown initiated. My throat tightened, not with fear, but with a strange, almost exhilarating calm. The system I had written, dismissed as paranoid over-engineering, was alive, breathing without me. Its silent countdown had already begun. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and walked down the street. Every step measured, unhurried. Inside the tower, panic hadn't yet taken root, but the first sparks were there. I knew how Martin would react. He'd roll his eyes, brush off the warnings from IT as technical hiccups, and order a simple reboot. That was always his answer: throw a switch, patch the surface, pretend control had never slipped. And right now, he was doing exactly that. I could picture it vividly. IT staff clustered around monitors, error messages cascading in red across the screens. One timid engineer pointing out that the handshake protocol was refusing entry, another mumbling that the architecture demanded biometric renewal, and Martin, towering over them, cutting them off mid-sentence. Restart the system, now. They would obey. Fear had trained them better than loyalty ever could. Fingers would hover nervously over keyboards. Commands would fly. Servers would cycle down and hum back up again. Lights would blink like a false promise of order returning. But the safeguards I had built weren't so easily dismissed. They weren't fragile circuits that bent to panic. They were teeth buried in the spine of the network, waiting for this exact betrayal. Every backup copy, every mirror server, every contingency plan had been tied to one lock: my biometric renewal. Without it, the reboot would only circle back into failure. And that's exactly what happened, even from the street. I could imagine the moment silence spread across the IT floor. The reboot sequence would hang, the screens would refresh, only to display the same cruel line: authorization required, renewal pending. I didn't need to be there to hear Martin's fury, or the excuses he would demand. His arrogance had written this script long ago. All I had to do now was let the countdown run. I walked on, blending into the flow of strangers on the sidewalk. My defiance was invisible, inaudible, yet stronger than any outburst. Let Martin rage, let the system stall. I had already spoken, in code, in law, in silence, and silence would win. I found a bench across the street from Orion Tower, its shadow stretching like a blade across the pavement. The rush of the city moved around me, street vendors hawking breakfast wraps, delivery bikes weaving through traffic, tourists craning their necks at skyscrapers. To anyone else, I looked like a woman on her coffee break, but I wasn't on break. I was waiting for the slow unraveling of an empire. The plastic bottle of water in my hand dripped condensation onto my palm. I twisted the cap off and took a long drink, letting the cool liquid slide down my throat. Across the avenue, Orion's mirrored facade gleamed in the sun, confident as ever, as if glass and steel could mask the chaos already beginning to spread inside. My lips curled not in joy, but in something sharper, something colder. My phone buzzed. A text from my daughter lit up the screen. "Mom, will you be home for cake tonight?" The words blurred as my eyes stung. She was only 12, but she had already learned to expect absence more than presence. Every year, I had promised her a birthday I couldn't deliver, one more late-night meeting, one more project Martin demanded, one more excuse that felt hollow even as I said it. The truth was simple. I had never been home. Not once. I stared at the message, fingers hovering, but I didn't reply. What could I write? Yes, a lie. No, another wound. Instead, I placed the phone face down on the bench and exhaled slowly. The irony wasn't lost on me. Martin had accused me of clinging to old ideas. Yet the only old idea that mattered now was my daughter's hope that I might finally keep a promise. The phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't her. The alert banner stretched across the screen: global sync disruption, redundant backups inaccessible. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Right on time. Inside that glittering tower, I could almost hear the escalation, the clipped tones of middle managers shouting over one another, each trying to prove they weren't to blame. "Check the backups," one would bark. "Roll us to the mirror servers," another would yell. And then the dawning realization: none of it worked. Every pathway still led back to me. I imagined Martin at the head of the table, his jaw clenched, insisting it was a temporary glitch. His pride wouldn't allow him to admit the truth, not to his staff, not to himself. He would dismiss the panic as incompetence, certain the system would bend. But the system had no reason to bend anymore, sitting there, sipping water in the morning sun. I felt no rush, no need to interfere. The panic belonged to them now. My silence was my shield, and their noise was my victory. The countdown ticked on, and I watched, amused, as Orion Tower began to eat itself alive. What do you think happens next? Will Kelly finally unleash everything she's been holding back? Or will Martin find one last desperate move to fight back? Stick around, you won't want to miss how this countdown explodes. The first real cracks showed not on a screen, but in human voices. By the half-hour mark, the trading floor below Orion Tower was no longer a hum of activity. It was chaos. Traders pounded their desks, headsets pressed tight, voices hoarse from shouting. Transactions worth billions froze midstream. Digital lifeblood trapped in the system like clots in an artery. Every second stretched into losses no one could calculate fast enough. Phones rang without pause. Executives tried answering two at once, sweat dripping down their temples as clients screamed from Frankfurt, Dubai, and Tokyo. "Where is my money? Why is the ledger stuck? Who signed off on this?" The calls stacked like a rising tide, swallowing anyone foolish enough to think they could tread water in it. On the 36th floor, the boardroom stank of panic masked by cologne. Martin Kellerman stood at the head of the table, his fists pressed against polished wood. Around him, directors fired accusations across the room like darts. Some blamed IT, others compliance. Still others claimed sabotage. But one voice cut sharper than the rest. "Why?" a board member demanded. Her tone edged with fury. Was the system architect fired before the launch? The words hung like smoke. Even Martin flinched. Just slightly. Before recovering his posture, he sneered, dismissing it with a wave. She was irrelevant. Her ideas were old. Orion doesn't need dead weight. But the silence afterward told him the answer wasn't enough. People shifted in their seats. They weren't buying it. At the far end of the table, one of the corporate attorneys leaned forward, voice low, almost hesitant. There's something else." He glanced at a tablet, then back at the faces around him. "I checked the patent registry. The filings. They don't all list Orion as the owner. There's an LLC Bryant Systems listed as principal." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Martin's face hardened. "Enough," he barked, cutting the air with his hand. "Don't spread nonsense in this room. That woman has nothing. Do you understand?" The lawyer's mouth snapped shut. Pride had always been Martin's sharpest blade, and now it cut through truth itself. He would rather bury the fact than admit the company was already standing on borrowed ground. Outside, on my bench across the street. I took another sip of water and let the faintest smile creep across my lips. They were asking the right questions now, for the first time in years. The cracks in their loyalty weren't aimed at me. They were aimed at him. Vindication wasn't loud. Not yet. It was quiet, coiled, waiting, and it was mine. Martin's voice cracked slightly as he leaned toward the speakerphone, but he forced it back into that familiar corporate baritone. "Ladies and gentlemen, Orion has the situation under control," he declared, each syllable polished, his tone rehearsed for investor calls that usually ended with applause. "This is nothing more than a technical hiccup. Our systems are stable, and our teams are addressing the matter as we speak." But the truth bled through the line in ways he couldn't contain. In the background, shouts erupted from the trading floor, voices sharp, frantic, impossible to ignore. Phones slammed down, someone barked. "Billions are locked!" Another shouted. "Backups aren't responding." The chaos leaked into every pause of Martin's speech, like static through a broken radio. On the other end of the call, the investors didn't buy the performance. "We can hear it." "Martin!" one snapped, voice cutting cold. "Your building is on fire." Another interrupted. "If you don't resolve this within the hour, our funds are pulling out." A third added bluntly, "We're already moving liquidity. We can't afford to wait." Martin swallowed hard, sweat slicking his palms beneath the table. He tried again, layering pride over fear. "There is no cause for alarm. Orion's infrastructure is state-of-the-art. This momentary stall is a result of outdated coding we've already replaced." But even as he said the words, he knew how hollow they sounded. Investors weren't blind. And they weren't stupid. They knew money when it was moving and when it wasn't. His arrogance, his endless dismissal of Kelly's old ideas, could not drown out the reality screaming through the phone lines. Across the city, in newsrooms buzzing with caffeine and cynicism, journalists began digging. It took less than 15 minutes for one reporter to stumble across a forgotten white paper written years ago by Kelly Bryant. It had been archived on a minor academic server, ignored at the time because Orion dismissed it as too cautious, too paranoid. The headline above the PDF read, "Safeguards in Network Infrastructure, Why Architect Authorization Must Be Permanent." Within minutes, the link spread like fire across social media. Industry veterans retweeted it. Analysts blogged about it. Forums lit up with comments she warned them. They fired the only person who could have prevented this. By the time the article hit trending, screenshots of the white paper were circulating faster than Orion's own press team could react. Investors on the call began quoting it back at Martin, their voices turning colder, sharper. "She saw this coming," one said flatly. "You ignored her." Martin's jaw tightened. Pride had always been his armor, but now it was cracking, piece by piece. He wanted to shout them down, to insist control remained his. But even he could hear the truth in the background noise. Orion was collapsing in real time. Desperation seeped through the cracks of his arrogance, staining every word he spoke. And for the first time, Martin realized the empire he had built on bravado was slipping beyond his grasp. The memories came uninvited, pressing against the edges of my mind as I sat on the park bench, watching Orion Tower shimmer with false confidence. Years earlier, when Martin Kellerman was still clawing his way up the executive ladder, he had borrowed one of my prototypes. I can still remember his exact words as he hovered near my desk, voice lowered like we were sharing a secret. "This is brilliant. Kelly, let me present it on Monday. It'll get us the backing we need. Don't worry, you'll be rewarded in time." He had smiled then, the kind of smile meant to disarm, to make you believe loyalty and patience would pay off. I agreed, foolishly, because I thought we were building something together. That following week, Martin walked out of that meeting with a promotion, his name etched in headlines, his future secured. My name wasn't mentioned once. The promise of reward in time never came. No bonus, no recognition, no acknowledgement that the cornerstone of Orion's infrastructure had begun in my apartment, at my kitchen table, with coffee stains on the blueprints. What I received instead was more work, more deadlines, more sacrifices stacked like bricks to build a tower where only his name gleamed at the top. The bitterness sat in me like old rust, corroding every memory of that era. I had swallowed it for years, convincing myself the next promotion, the next quarter, the next handshake would bring the recognition I deserved, but it never arrived. And now, as I stared at the building across the street, I realized Martin had only ever needed me as scaffolding. Once the structure stood tall, he believed he could strip me away. Inside that glass fortress, fractures deepened. I could imagine the boardroom cracking under its own weight, directors blaming managers, managers blaming IT blaming vendors. Colleagues who once smiled in hallways now shouted across tables, eager to point fingers anywhere but themselves. The culture Martin had cultivated fear, dressed up as loyalty, was splintering. Each accusation was another thread snapping loose from Orion's unraveling fabric. The thought should have made me angry, but instead, I felt something darker, more settled, a bitterness that had matured into quiet satisfaction. I didn't need to raise my voice anymore. Their own would tear them apart. I unlocked my phone and opened a private forum where engineers, analysts, and insiders lingered in anonymity. My fingers hovered above the keyboard for a moment before typing a single line. Ideas don't expire, they wait. I hit send. The words moved faster than any virus I had ever coded. Within minutes, the post was screenshot, reposted, debated. Who wrote this? One thread asked. Is this about Orion? Another demanded. On social media, the phrase began trending, attached to speculation, memes, and thinly veiled accusations. Industry veterans whispered what insiders already suspected, that Kelly Bryant, the so-called architect of old ideas, was no longer silent. Across the street, Orion Tower's glass walls glimmered, but inside its core, the infection spread fear, doubt, recognition that their empire was rotting from within, and for the first time, my bitterness didn't feel like a burden. It felt like justice. Finally sharpening its teeth, the phone vibrated against the wooden bench, a steady pulse in my palm. I flipped it over, and the screen lit with a message I had been waiting for. As patient as the clock itself, system lockdown. 47 minutes elapsed. Renewal signature required. There it was, the moment of inevitability. I leaned back, the sun warm on my face, the city still rushing around me as if billions weren't freezing mid-transfer. To them, it was just another weekday morning. To me, it was the culmination of 17 years of sacrifice compressed into 47 precise minutes. Inside Orion Tower, the collapse had reached its endpoint. No more partial failures, no more stalled transactions, no more managers scrambling for excuses. The entire network was dark. Screens across the globe displayed the same blunt demand, my signature or nothing. I could picture Martin in that instant, his face red, then pale, then something in between, as realization carved into him like stone. For years, he believed ownership came from titles, from press releases, from swaggering confidence in boardrooms. But ownership doesn't live in corner offices. It lives in patents, in architecture, in the quiet signatures hidden deep in the code. And none of that belonged to him. Every client Orion had ever boasted about, banks, corporations, even governments, were now locked out of the very product they had paid for. The only key existed with me, the woman he'd branded obsolete. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't an automated message. It was a number I recognized instantly, though it had never before appeared on my screen. Martin Kellerman. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before sliding my thumb across the glass. I didn't speak. I wanted to hear him first. Kelly, the voice that had mocked me in front of hundreds just hours ago, was now stripped of arrogance. It was thin, cracked, trembling at the edges. We need you back in here. The system won't run without you. Just come back. Sign it. We can make this right." For a moment, I said nothing, listening to his shallow breathing. Each inhale was jagged, like a man struggling against water closing over his head. The silence stretched, and I imagined the board leaning in, desperate, straining to hear if I would answer, if salvation was possible. Cold anticipation settled through me like ice water in my veins. I had known this moment would come, but knowing didn't dull its edge. This was the call he swore he would never have to make, the call that erased every insult, every dismissal, every smirk about old ideas. My fingers traced the edge of the phone, steady, deliberate. The power wasn't in shouting, not anymore. The power was in waiting, in letting his own fear echo louder than anything I could say. "Kelly, please," he whispered now, the word foreign on his tongue. "Name your terms." I closed my eyes, savoring the quiet, the tension, the collapse of a man who thought he was untouchable. The countdown was finished. My moment had arrived. Martin's voice spilled through the phone, frantic but dressed in the costume of negotiation. "Kelly, listen, please. We can undo this. Come back. We'll reinstate you, with full salary, bonuses, anything you want. Just sign the authorization. The system will be back online within minutes, and no one has to know how close it came." I let him talk. Each offer tumbled out faster, like chips tossed into the pot by a gambler already sure the hand is lost. "Equity, do you want? Equity, a board seat, your old title, I'll double your package. Triple it, just come back in." His desperation was a steady current beneath the words, no longer masked by pride. The silence between us was mine to shape, and I shaped it with care. He thought he was negotiating with leverage, but leverage had left the room 47 minutes ago. What I heard, beneath every syllable, wasn't power, it was fear. And behind that fear, I heard something else echoes. My father's funeral, where I stood alone at the graveside because Martin had sent me a calendar invite for a critical demo. My daughter's recital, where the only seat that stayed empty was the one I had promised to fill. The birthdays, the holidays, the quiet dinners never shared. Each memory pressed itself against me now, not as regret, but as evidence. Evidence of how much had been stolen. Martin's voice cracked again. "Kelly, don't do this. You've made your point. Let's be reasonable. Reasonable." That word almost drew a laugh from me. How many times had I been the reasonable one? Covering for his arrogance, smoothing the edges of his half-truths, working weekends so he could play the visionary reasonable had been my curse. Now, control was mine. And it didn't require reason. It required silence, precision, and the patience to let a man crumble under the weight of his own undoing. I lifted the phone closer, so he would hear the calm in my voice. My words were measured, sharp enough to cut through every excuse, every bargain, every hollow promise he tried to offer, without my signature. "Martin," I said, steady as stone, "everything you own is just a draft." For a moment, the line held. I could hear him inhale, then stop, as if his lungs had forgotten the motion. No rebuttal came, no counteroffer, just silence, heavy and final. Then I ended the call. The screen went black in my hand. My reflection ghosted across the glass. Calm, unflinching, around me. The city kept moving, unaware of the empire that had just collapsed into quiet ruin. The power wasn't in shouting, it never had been. The power was in control, the kind that doesn't flinch, doesn't waver, doesn't wait for permission. And I held it now, colder and steadier than he could ever imagine. By noon, the headlines were everywhere. My phone lit up with notification after notification, each one louder than the last. Orion Systems collapses in 47 minutes. Patent ownership tied to former architect. Industry shaken by safeguard revelation. The story had escaped the walls of Orion Tower and taken on a life of its own. I skimmed the headlines with an odd sense of calm. They weren't gloating. They weren't cruel. They were matter of fact, for the first time in years. The truth carried its own weight, without me having to beg anyone to see it. Then came the flood of emails. Old colleagues, some who had avoided my eyes that morning in the auditorium, filled my inbox with apologies. We didn't know. We should have stood up. I'm sorry for the way things ended. Their words blurred together into a chorus of regret. I read none of them. My finger hovered over the delete button, and with one motion, I erased them all. Because vindication wasn't about their guilt, it was about my release. When I walked into my home later that afternoon, the stillness felt like a balm. On the kitchen counter, a folded piece of notebook paper waited. In my daughter's uneven handwriting, it read, "Mom, will you be at my birthday this year?" The question cut deeper than Martin's insults ever had. I held the note in both hands, my throat tightening for the first time. I knew the answer was yes. This time, I could finally be there. Behind me, the television played, volume low but clear enough to catch the breaking segment. A reporter's voice carried across the room. Kelly Bryant has become a symbol today, a woman who reminded the industry that so-called old ideas can safeguard the future. I smiled, not the bitter curl I had worn for years, but something lighter, something that felt like freedom. My revenge had started as a personal reckoning, but it had grown into something larger. Justice wasn't just mine, it was public, undeniable, and it carried my name, for once. I didn't feel invisible, I felt seen, sometimes. Justice doesn't roar. It waits in silence until the moment is right, and when it arrives, it liberates more than one life. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Kelly's revenge was enough, or would you have taken it further? Tap like if you felt the same release she did. Share this video with someone who's been underestimated, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story.